do last weekend? This week's story is about our friends Topsy and Tim and what happened to them on Saturday. Topsy and Tim's dad was playing football for his old school one Saturday afternoon. Topsy and Tim were going to watch the match. Mummy found an old stripy muffler of Dad's and made it into 2 mufflers, one for Topsy and one for Tim. She made rosettes for them too. "Who wants to be referee?" asked Dad. "Me!" shouted Topsy and Tim together. "Oh, I think Tim shouted louder," said Dad, smiling. He gave Tim a referee's set, a toy watch, and a red plastic whistle. "And here's my old football rattle for you, Topsy," said Dad. It was a big football rattle and made a wonderfully loud noise. Tim wished he had it, but still, he was referee. Dad had to hurry off then because he had to be at the football ground first to change into his football togs. Although it was a sunny day, Mummy brought out Topsy and Tim's Wellington boots. "Why are we wearing our Wellingtons?" asked Topsy and Tim. "Oh, you'll see when we get there," said Mummy. The football ground was very muddy. Topsy and Tim were very glad they were wearing their Wellingtons. Topsy trod in a deep, sticky puddle and left one Wellington behind. "Now you'll have to hop," said Mummy, laughing. But a friend of Dad's stepped out of the crowd and gave Topsy a piggyback over the mud. Everyone smiled and made way for them, and they went right to the front of the crowd. The footballers trotted out of their hut to start the game. "There's Dad!" shouted Topsy. "Dad! Dad!" called Tim. Dad turned and waved, but he was rather serious and busy. The football game was exciting at first, but then the footballers went to play at the other end of the field. Topsy and Tim began to fidget. Suddenly, the big muddy ball landed right at their feet. "Kick it in, twins! Kick it in!" shouted the crowd. Topsy and Tim kicked the ball both at once. Topsy's Wellington flew off, and Tim sat down with a bump. But the ball rolled straight back onto the field. Tim was blowing his red plastic whistle as hard as he could. But it was not nearly so noisy as Topsy's rattle. A man in the crowd took a big silver whistle from his pocket. He handed it to Tim and said, "Try this one." Tim took a deep breath and blew. Went the whistle. Then he took his finger off the hole and blew again, even harder. The big silver whistle shrilled so loudly that Tim's ears tingled. The footballers stopped kicking the ball and looked at the real referee. They thought he had blown his whistle to make them stop playing. Then Tim blew the big silver whistle again. And the footballers looked at him. Some of them laughed, but some looked rather cross. "Give me that whistle, Tim," said Mummy sternly. The real referee looked at his real watch. "The game is nearly over now," said Mummy. Then the crowd began to shout and wave. There was a great cheer. "It's Dad!" cried Mummy. "Dad scored a goal!" The real referee blew his whistle. Tim blew his red plastic whistle. Topsy whisked her rattle round and round. "We won!" shouted Topsy and Tim. "We won the football match!" And they shouted and whistled and rattled all the way home. Did you like that story? I think we've time for another story about Topsy and Tim. This is about what happens to them on a Sunday. A Sunday when Topsy and Tim were staying in the country with Uncle Frank and Auntie Doris. After breakfast, Uncle Frank cut 2 big bunches of flowers. He asked Topsy and Tim to take 1 bunch to the vicar and 1 bunch to Miss Tabitha Tick, and he told them how to find the way. They soon found Miss Tabitha Tick standing at the door of her cottage. Miss Tabitha Tick was a very deaf old lady. She took both bunches of flowers. "1 bunch is for the vicar," said Topsy. But Miss Tabitha Tick just smiled and nodded and closed the door. Topsy and Tim banged on the door and shouted as loud as they could. But Miss Tabitha Tick couldn't hear them. "What shall we do?" cried Topsy. "Oh, there are lots of flowers in the country," said Tim. "Let's gather some more for the vicar." Topsy and Tim found lots of yellow buttercups in the fields and some daisies and dandelions. But it took a lot of these little flowers to make a big bunch. Topsy made friends with a big brown cow. She wanted the cow to smell her pretty flowers, but the cow made a mistake and ate them, all in a mouthful. So Topsy and Tim had to find another bunch of flowers. It was a long, long time before they had a bunch big enough to take to the vicar. At last, they reached the vicar's front door. But the lady who opened the door said, "Sorry, ducks, the vicar's in church." The church was full of people, and the vicar was in the pulpit, talking in a very loud voice. "There he is," said Tim, and the twins walked right down the middle of the church and gave their flowers to the vicar. Everyone smiled. A gentleman said, "Your Uncle Frank is looking for you." He took them out of the church, and there was Uncle Frank, walking down the street, looking very cross. "But But Uncle Frank laughed when they told him their story. "Next time, we'll all go into church together," he said. And they all went home to a good Sunday dinner. We'll have another story about Topsy and Tim another day. I'll see you next week. Goodbye.